Imagine, if you will, the sensory architecture of a major international airport. It is a place defined by a specific, relentless kinetic energy. It is a cathedral of movement, a symphony of roaring. Jet engines, the rhythmic thud of heavy luggage hitting rubber carousels, and the polyglot hum of thousands of travelers rushing to connect with the world. An airport is the physical manifestation of globalization. It is a node in the network of commerce that never sleeps. It is a place where time is money and silence is the enemy. Now, transport yourself to the southern tip of Sri Lanka, to the arid district of Hambantota. Here, amidst the scrub jungle and the dry heat, stands a structure that looks, from a distance, exactly like one of those bustling hubs. It has a gleaming terminal, building with a roof delicately shaped like a lotus flower. It has 12 check-in counters equipped with state-of-the-art baggage handling systems. It has a 3,500-meter runway, capable of landing the world's largest passenger aircraft, the Airbus A380. It was built to handle 1 million passengers a year. But if you walk through the automatic sliding doors today, you are not met with the roar of commerce. You are met with a silence so profound, so unnatural, that it feels less like infrastructure and more like a tomb. The check-in counters are unmanned, covered in a fine layer of dust. The flight information display screens, capable of listing hundreds of departures, are often completely blank or displaying a single word. None. The only sound, echoing through the cavernous departure hall, is the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of a peacock strutting across the tarmac, where jetliners should be parking. This is the Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport. In the chaotic world of aviation, it holds a title that no nation wants to claim. In 2014, just a year after it opened with fanfare and military flyovers, it was dubbed by the global press as the world's emptiest airport. The statistics surrounding this facility are so absurd they sound like fiction. In its early years of operation, there were months where the airport's entire revenue was less than its electricity bill. There were days when the number of staff members wandering the empty corridors outnumbered the passengers by a ratio of 50 to 1. At the height of its absurdity, the government, desperate to find a use for the cavernous spaces, resorted to using the high-tech cargo terminals not for air freight, but to store rice. Thousands of sacks of paddy were piled high in a facility designed for global logistics, a stark symbol of a modern industrial ambition reverting to an agrarian reality. But do not mistake this for a comedy. The silence of Mattala is incredibly expensive. This airport was not free. It was built with over $200 million of borrowed money, high interest, commercial loans that carried sovereign guarantees. It is a physical manifestation of a debt trap that would eventually snap shut on the entire nation when Sri Lanka defaulted on its sovereign debt. In 2022, plunging 22 million people into poverty, fueling hyperinflation, and sparking violent protests that toppled the government, Mattala sat at the center of the storm. It is a crime scene of economic mismanagement. It is a vanity project so colossal, so disconnected from economic reality, that it helped drag a promising middle-income nation into the abyss of insolvency. This is not just a story about a building. It is a story about the arrogance of power. It is a story about geopolitical gamesmanship between China and India. And it is a warning to the developing world about what happens when you sign contracts you cannot understand to build infrastructure you do not need. Today, we are traveling to the heart of the Sri Lankan jungle to walk the empty halls of a ghost terminal. We're going to follow the money trail from the vaults of Beijing to the pockets of a ruling dynasty to understand how a sanctuary for elephants was paved over to create the world's most expensive white elephant. To understand why a massive international airport was dropped into the middle of a wildlife sanctuary 150 miles away from the country's commercial capital, we cannot look at standard economics. A rational feasibility study would have killed this project on day one. Geography would have said no. Demographics would have said no. Logic would have said no. To understand Mattala, we must look at the psychology of one man, Mahinda Rajapaksa. In 2009, Mahinda Rajapaksa was more than just a president. He was a figure of near mythological status to the Sinhalese majority of Sri Lanka. He had just brutally and decisively ended the Sri Lankan Civil War, a grueling 30-year conflict against the Tamil Tigers that had bled the country dry. With the war over, Rajapaksa possessed absolute political capital. He had rewritten the constitution to remove term limits. He had consolidated power within his family. He could do anything, and what he wanted to do was build a legacy that would outlast the pyramids. Rajapaksa hailed from Hambantota, a rural, arid district in the deep south of the island. For decades, Hambantota was a backwater, a place of scrub jungles, fishing villages, and poverty. It was far removed from the bustling capital of Colombo on the west coast. But in the president's mind, Hambantota was not a backwater. It was the future capital. It was to be the seat of a new dynastic empire. This is a classic case of the edifice complex, the overwhelming desire of authoritarian leaders to imprint their name onto the landscape with concrete and steel. Rajapaksa envisioned a new commercial hub in his hometown. He wanted a massive deep-sea port to capture the shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean. He wanted an international cricket stadium. He wanted a convention center. And, to crown it all, he wanted a grand international airport. The vision was seductive. To his supporters, the narrative was one of decentralization. Why should Colombo have all the wealth, they asked. We will build a second engine of growth in the south. It was framed as development for the forgotten rural poor. But in reality, it was a vanity project of staggering proportions. But where would the money come from? Sri Lanka, emerging from 3 decades of war, was cash poor. The West was hesitant to lend, citing grave human rights concerns regarding the final stages of the Civil War. The traditional lenders like the IMF and the World Bank came with strings attached, requirements for transparency, austerity, and due diligence. Rajapaksa didn't want strings. He wanted shovels in the ground. Enter this string of pearls. At this precise moment in history, the People's Republic of China was looking to expand its influence across the Indian Ocean. Beijing needed to secure its energy supply lines from the Middle East. They needed friendly ports and strategic footholds to counter the influence of India and the United States. Rajapaksa needed cash. China needed access. It was a marriage of convenience that would prove catastrophic for the island nation. The financing for the Mattala Airport didn't come from aid grants. It came primarily from the Export-Import Bank of China, or Exim Bank. These were commercial loans. While often marketed as development assistance, the terms were far less forgiving than soft loans from Japan or the World Bank. The interest rates were higher, the grace periods were shorter, and, critically, there was almost no requirement for economic viability. If you wanted to build it, China would fund it, provided you used a Chinese contractor. The feasibility studies for the airport were ominous. Aviation experts warned that there was simply no demand. Tourists land in Colombo to go to the beaches or the Cultural Triangle. Business travelers go to Colombo for the commerce. Hambantota had neither the hotel infrastructure nor the business density to justify a second international hub. The International Air Transport Association, or ITA, reportedly advised against the project, noting that splitting the country's limited air traffic would only harm the existing hub in Colombo. But the ego does not read feasibility studies. The ego looks at a map and sees a kingdom. Rajapaksa pushed the project through with the subtlety of a bulldozer. The contract for construction was awarded to China Harbor Engineering Company, a state-owned enterprise. This is a crucial detail in the economics of architecture. The money didn't really leave China. The Exim Bank lent the money to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka paid the Chinese contractor, and the contractor sent the profits back to Beijing. Sri Lanka was left with the asset and the debt. It was a closed loop of capital extraction masked as development aid. And the name? There was no subtlety there either. The airport wasn't named the Hambantota International Airport. It was christened the Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport, just like the Mattala Rajapaksa port nearby, and the Mahinda Rajapaksa International Cricket Stadium. It was a branding exercise funded by sovereign debt. The foundation stone was laid in November 2009, mere months after the war ended. It was a rush job, driven by political timelines rather than engineering necessities. The president wanted his airport, and he wanted it now. He was building a dynastic stronghold, a monument to his family's rule that would stand for centuries. He didn't know that he was actually building the instrument of his own downfall. Before we see how this dream turned into a nightmare, make sure you're subscribed to Build on Money to uncover more hidden economic histories. Building an international airport is a monumental feat of engineering. It requires flattening mountains, diverting rivers, and laying millions of tons of high-grade asphalt. But building an airport in Mattala presented a unique challenge: nature itself. The chosen site was not a barren wasteland waiting for development. It was a thriving ecosystem. Specifically, it was located right in the middle of a migratory route for elephants and a habitat for hundreds of species of birds. It was literally a jungle. In most functioning democracies, environmental impact assessments are the brakes of infrastructure projects. They're designed to stop governments from doing something stupid, like paving over a sanctuary. But in the Rajapaksa era, environmental assessments were often treated as bureaucratic hurdles to be jumped over or simply ignored. The order from the top was clear: build it. The cost of the project was initially pegged at around $209 million. The vast majority, roughly $190 million, came from the Chinese loans. As the bulldozers rolled in, the unexpected costs of fighting nature began to mount. The engineers faced a war of attrition against the local wildlife. The area was home to thousands of peacocks, heavy, slow-flying birds that are a nightmare for jet engines. During the construction phase, reports surfaced of habitat destruction forcing wild elephants into nearby villages, creating a human-elephant conflict that plagues the region to this day. But the construction pressed on at breakneck speed. 2,000 hectares of forest were cleared. A 3,500-meter runway, one of the longest in Southeast Asia, was laid down. A terminal building spanning 10,000 square meters rose from the dust, designed with eco-friendly concepts like natural lighting. A bitter irony, given the ecological destruction required to build it. The country garden speed, often seen in Chinese infrastructure projects, was evident here. The goal was to finish before the next election cycle, to give the president a ribbon to cut. Quality control concerns were whispered but rarely shouted. Let's talk about the specific numbers, adjusted for the economic reality of Sri Lanka. $209 million might not sound like a lot for an airport in Western terms. Renovating a single terminal at JFK can cost billions. But for Sri Lanka, a developing economy, with a GDP of roughly $60 billion at the time, this was a colossal expenditure of foreign currency. To put it in perspective, that $209 million could have built 3 major teaching hospitals. It could have modernized the entire railway network of the southern province. It could have funded the national education budget for a year. Instead, it was poured into a patch of concrete in a region with a population density lower than some deserts. And the delays? They weren't caused by lack of funds or labor. They were caused by the sheer absurdity of the location. As the opening day approached in 2013, the cracks in the plan became visible. Test flights revealed that the bird issue was not just a nuisance. It was a lethal hazard. The Civil Aviation Authority had to scramble. They didn't solve the problem by moving the airport. They tried to move the nature. Firecrackers were used to scare birds. Sonic devices were installed. There were even reports of security forces being tasked with shooting at wildlife to clear the glide path. It was man versus nature, funded by high-interest debt. When the airport finally opened in March 2013, it was a grand spectacle. Sri Lankan Airlines, the national carrier, was forced to route flights through Mattala. The president landed in the first flight, beaming. The water cannons saluted the plane. The red carpet was rolled out. The state media hailed it as a triumph, a new dawn for the nation. But the moment the VIPs left, the reality set in. The cost of construction was a sunk cost, money gone forever. But the cost of operation was just beginning. An airport is a beast that eats money every single day. You need air traffic controllers, security, fire crews, electricity for the massive air conditioning units, janitorial staff. You need to pay them whether one plane lands or 100. The break-even point for an airport of this size requires roughly 800,000 to 1 million passengers a year. In its first year, Mattala struggled to attract a fraction of that. The cost wasn't just the loan repayment. It was the daily hemorrhage of cash to keep the lights on in an empty cathedral. It forces us to ask a difficult question about the nature of investment. If you build a factory, you expect products. If you build a road, you expect traffic. But if you build an airport where nobody wants to go, what have you actually built? You have built a liability. This was not an investment. It was an expense, and the bill was about to come due. Would you have invested in this? Let us know in the comments. The ink was barely dry on the opening ceremony press releases when the financial reality of Mattala began to cannibalize the dream. To understand the scale of the failure, we must look at the operational model. An airport generates revenue through two primary streams: aeronautical revenue, landing fees, parking charges, and passenger service fees, and non-aeronautical revenue, duty-free, sales, retail rent, and advertising. Both of these streams require one essential ingredient: people. Mattala had none. In the first few months of operation, the government, desperate to save face and prove the viability of the president's pet project, engaged in a form of economic theater. They strong-armed the national carrier, Sri Lankan Airlines, into routing its flights through Mattala. Flights bound for Colombo from destinations like Bangkok or Riyadh were forced to make a tag-on stop in Hambantota. Imagine the absurdity of this logistics chain. A wide-body Airbus A330, burning thousands of dollars of jet fuel per hour, would descend from cruising altitude, land on the Mattala tarmac, taxi to the gate, and sit there. Often, not a single passenger would disembark. Sometimes one or two confused tourists would get off. The plane would then have to throttle up, burn more fuel to take off, and fly the short hop to Colombo. This was not aviation. It was a political subsidy disguised as a flight path. It bled the national airline dry. Estimates suggest that Sri Lankan Airlines was losing millions of dollars annually just to keep the illusion of activity alive at Mattala. It was a parasitic relationship where the airport was feeding off the lifeblood of the national carrier, dragging both entities toward insolvency. The international carriers, who were not beholden to the president's whims, voted with their landing gear. A few brave budget airlines like Fly Dubai and Air Arabia initially attempted to run routes to Mattala, lured by massive discounts on landing fees. But the economics were brutal. They were flying empty planes. And then the jungle fought back. The environmental warnings that had been ignored during construction manifested in a terrifying reality: bird strikes. In 2013, a Fly Dubai jet carrying passengers struck a peacock during takeoff. The impact shattered the windshield and forced an emergency landing. This wasn't just a maintenance issue. It was a PR catastrophe. In the aviation industry, safety is the only currency that matters more than money. When pilots deemed Mattala unsafe due to the uncontrolled wildlife, the airport's reputation was incinerated. Fly Dubai pulled out. Air Arabia pulled out. By 2014, the international airport was effectively a ghost town. The daily flight schedule shrank to zero. The duty-free shops, stocked with expensive perfumes and chocolates for a phantom clientele, shut their shutters. The staff, numbering in the hundreds, spent their days playing cards, staring at empty radar screens, and shooing wild animals away from the perimeter fence. Then came the moment that cemented Mattala's legacy as a global joke. In a desperate bid to utilize the massive, empty cargo terminals, the government authorized the unthinkable. The Paddy Marketing Board was allowed to store rice in the airport. Yes, rice. Thousands of sacks of paddy, harvested from the local fields, were trucked into the high-tech cargo hangars. The juxtaposition was jarring. Humidity-controlled storage units designed for sensitive electronics and pharmaceuticals were filled with raw grain. The terminal, built to smell of jet fuel and luxury cologne, smelled of fermentation and dust. It was a humiliation. It was the ultimate admission that the industrial dream had failed and the agrarian reality had reclaimed the land. But while the world laughed at the rice port, the financial cracks were turning into fissures. The debt service payments to the Exim Bank of China were coming due. This is the core of the debt trap analysis. The loans for Mattala were denominated in foreign currency. To pay them back, Sri Lanka needed to earn dollars or yuan, but the airport was earning almost nothing. In 2014, reports surfaced that the airport's annual revenue was roughly 300,000 Sri Lankan rupees, a few $1,000s, while its expenditure was in the billions. The ratio of loss was astronomical. Every dollar spent keeping the lights on at Mattala was a dollar that could not be used to import fuel, medicine, or fertilizer. The asset was not just failing to pay for itself. It was actively draining the national treasury. It was a negative asset. In the world of corporate finance, if a branch performs this poorly, you shut it down. But in the world of sovereign geopolitics and ego, you cannot shut it down. To close Mattala would be to admit that the king had built a castle on quicksand. So, they kept bleeding. The government kept borrowing to pay the interest on previous loans, a classic Ponzi scheme dynamic applied to sovereign debt. They were digging a hole to fill a hole. And Mattala was the shovel. If you're enjoying this financial breakdown, please hit the like button. It helps us navigate the algorithm and bring you more investigations like this. The political collapse came first, a prelude to the economic Armageddon. In January 2015, Mattala Rajapaksa, the man who believed he was invincible, lost the presidential election. It was a shock defeat. The opposition campaigned heavily on the corruption and waste of the Hambantota infrastructure projects. They painted Mattala not as a symbol of pride, but as a symbol of theft. The white elephant label stuck. The incoming government, led by Maithripala Sirisena, was left holding the bag. They opened the books and were horrified by what they found. The debt obligations were far worse than the public knew. The airport was hemorrhaging cash. They tried to pivot. They tried to turn Mattala into a flight school, a parking lot for grounded planes. Anything to generate revenue. Nothing worked. Then, the geopolitics took a darker turn. Desperate to offload the bleeding asset, the Sri Lankan government began looking for foreign buyers. They offered the airport to India. Why India? Not because Indian Airlines needed a hub in the Sri Lankan jungle, but because India was terrified of China's presence next door. The nearby Hambantota port had already succumbed to the debt trap. Unable to pay back the loans for the port, Sri Lanka was forced to lease it to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years in 2017. This effectively gave Beijing a sovereign chunk of territory in India's backyard. New Delhi panicked. They saw the airport, located just a few miles from the Chinese-controlled port, as a necessary strategic buffer. India proposed to lease the empty airport, not to fly planes but to keep the Chinese out. It was the economics of denial. The value of the airport wasn't in its utility. It was in its strategic location. Negotiations dragged on for years. The absurdity peaked. A ghost airport becoming a pawn in a chess game between two nuclear-armed superpowers, while the termites continued to eat the check-in counters. But the real collapse, the one that broke the nation, arrived in 2019 and accelerated through 2022. A convergence of catastrophes hit Sri Lanka. The Easter Sunday terrorist attacks in 2019 decimated the tourism industry. Then came COVID-19, shutting down travel globally. Then came the war in Ukraine, spiking oil prices. For a fragile economy, laden with unsustainable debt from vanity projects like Mattala, this was the death blow. The white elephants had eaten all the grass, and now there was nothing left. By early 2022, Sri Lanka ran out of foreign reserves. The country was insolvent. The scenes on the streets of Colombo were apocalyptic. Miles-long queues for petrol. 13-hour power cuts because the government couldn't afford coal. Hospitals running out of life-saving medicines. Children fainting in schools from hunger. The currency collapsed, wiping out the savings of the middle class overnight. And where was the money that could have built a buffer against this crisis? It was cemented into the runway at Mattala. It was sunk into the breakwater of the Hambantota port. It was poured into the Lotus Tower in Colombo. Billions of dollars of borrowed capital had been incinerated on projects that generated zero economic return. The connection between the empty airport and the starving citizen was direct and causal. The debt service payments for these infrastructure projects had squeezed the fiscal space of the government to the point of asphyxiation. When the external shocks hit, there was no oxygen left in the room. In July 2022, the anger boiled over. Hundreds of thousands of protesters stormed the president's official residence in Colombo. They swam in his pool, cooked in his kitchen, and lay on his bed. Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother, Gotabaya, who was president at the time, was forced to flee the country. The dynasty that had built Mattala was chased out by the very people they claimed to be developing the country for. The airport remained silent throughout the revolution. While the capital burned, Mattala sat pristine and empty, its solar-powered. Lights turning on automatically at dusk to illuminate a tarmac devoid of planes. It stood as a silent witness to the destruction of the economy. The human cost of this collapse cannot be overstated. We often talk about sovereign default in abstract terms, spreadsheets, bond yields, IMF haircuts. But the reality is visceral. It is a mother cooking with firewood because cooking gas is unaffordable. It is a cancer patient being told a hospital has no chemotherapy drugs. It is a generation of young people lining up at the passport office, desperate to leave the country there. Leaders bankrupted. The construction of Mattala didn't just waste money, it stole the future. It diverted critical resources away from education, healthcare, and sustainable energy into a concrete ego trip. The opportunity cost of Mattala is measured in the stunted growth of a generation. As the dust settles on the political crisis, the airport remains. It is too expensive to dismantle, too useless to operate, and too politically toxic to sell. It exists in a zombie state, a distressed asset on the balance sheet of a bankrupt nation. But the story isn't over. As Sri Lanka undergoes a painful restructuring program under the IMF, the fate of Mattala is once again on the table. Can it be salvaged? Or will it stand for centuries as a modern ruin, a cautionary temple to the gods of bad debt? Following the economic collapse of 2022, Mattala entered a strange, purgatorial state of existence. It was no longer just an empty building. It became a bizarre mirror reflecting the global crises of the era. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the airport finally found a use. It wasn't used for tourism or trade. It was repurposed as a quarantine center for returning migrant workers. The Grand Terminal, designed to welcome high-spending luxury travelers with duty-free cognac and silk scarves, was filled with the weary, the sick, and the stranded. The baggage carousels were silenced, replaced by the hushed tones of medical personnel in hazmat suits. It was a grim utility, a field hospital erected in the shell of a palace, a testament to a nation that had prioritized concrete over healthcare capacity. Then, in another twist of geopolitical irony, the airport briefly flickered to life due to the war in Ukraine. As Western sanctions tightened on Russia, Russian airlines began looking for friendly destinations that would still accept their planes and their payment methods. Sri Lanka, desperate for any foreign currency to buy fuel, opened its arms. For a brief window, Mattala became a niche hub for Russian charter flights. Red Wings Airlines began dropping tourists off in the tropical heat of Hambantota. But these were not sustainable economic arteries. They were zombie operations, sporadic, desperate pulses of activity that did nothing to service the massive debt mountain looming over the facility. The revenue generated from a few weekly charter flights couldn't even cover the cost of air conditioning the terminal, let alone chip away at the hundreds of millions owed to the Chinese banks. The airport also found a humiliating utility as a parking lot. In the aviation world, when planes are grounded or airlines go bust, the aircraft need to be stored somewhere dry and cheap. Mattala, with its massive tarmac and zero traffic, was perfect. For long stretches, the only aircraft on the ground were grounded jets gathering dust, their engines covered in protective tarps, looking like giant, dormant insects. It was a graveyard for machines, hosted by a graveyard of ambition. As we stand in the wreckage of the Sri Lankan economy, we must address the elephant in the room. And for once, we don't mean the wild ones roaming the runway. We mean the Chinese debt trap theory. Western analysts and politicians have held up Mattala and the nearby Hambantota port as the definitive proof of debt trap diplomacy. The narrative goes like this. China deliberately lends money to vulnerable countries for unviable projects, knowing the country will default, allowing China to seize strategic assets or political leverage. Is Mattala a victim of a predatory Beijing? The answer is nuanced and perhaps even darker. While China certainly facilitated the project with easy credit and opaque terms, calling it a unilateral trap absolves the Sri Lankan leadership of their agency in this disaster. China didn't force Mattala Rajapaksa to build an airport in a jungle. China didn't force him to ignore the feasibility studies. China didn't force him to name it after himself. This was a collaborative heist. The Chinese contractors wanted the profits from construction. The Sri Lankan ruling family wanted the political prestige and the kickbacks that often accompany massive infrastructure contracts. Both sides got what they wanted in the short term. The long-term cost was pushed onto the Sri Lankan taxpayer. The Chinese banks, specifically Exim Bank, practiced what can be best described as predatory indifference. They didn't care if the airport made money. Their risk was covered by the sovereign guarantee of the Sri Lankan state. If the airport failed, the taxpayer would pay. If the taxpayer couldn't pay, the state would have to sell off other assets like the port. This is the true lesson of the economics of architecture in the 21st century. Infrastructure is no longer just concrete. It is geopolitical leverage. The debt incurred to build Mattala constrained Sri Lanka's foreign policy. It forced them to pivot toward Beijing when they couldn't pay, and then toward New Delhi and the IMF when the Chinese money ran out. The airport became a heavy chain around the neck of the nation's sovereignty. As we walk out of the silent terminal and onto the sun-baked tarmac, the heat distortions rising from the asphalt make the control tower look like a mirage. In many ways, that is exactly what it is. Mattala is the ultimate white elephant. The term comes from ancient Siam, now Thailand, where kings would gift rare white elephants to courtiers. They disliked. The animals were sacred, so they couldn't be put to work, but they were incredibly expensive to feed and maintain. The gift was designed to bankrupt the recipient. Mattala Rajapaksa gifted a white elephant to his own people. What is the lesson here? What does a $209 million ghost airport tell us about wealth, greed, and economics? First, it teaches us the danger of supply-side voodoo. There's a persistent economic fallacy among authoritarian builders. If you build it, they will come. Mattala proves that this is a lie. Infrastructure does not create demand, it facilitates it. You cannot concrete your way to prosperity if the market fundamentals are absent. A runway without a reason is just a very expensive road to nowhere. Second, it reveals the opportunity cost of ego. Every dollar spent on the marble floors of the Mattala VIP lounge was a dollar stolen from a rural clinic, a dilapidated school, or a starving child. Economics is the study of scarcity. Resources are finite. When leaders prioritize monuments over people, the result is not development, it is theft. The tragedy of Mattala is not just that it is empty, it is that it exists at all, while the basic needs of the population go unmet. Third, it is a warning about the opacity of debt. The loans that built Mattala were shrouded in secrecy. The terms were not debated in Parliament. The public didn't know the interest rates until it was too late. Democracy requires transparency, especially in finance. When a government can borrow billions in the dark, they will almost always spend it on things that shine in the light, regardless of the cost. And finally, it is a testament to the hubris of man against nature. The engineers thought they could defeat the jungle. They thought they could displace the elephants and the peacocks with fences and acoustic guns. But nature is patient. The jungle is already reclaiming the edges of the perimeter. The peacocks still strut on the runway. The elephants still break the fences. The concrete will eventually crack and fade, but the migratory routes will remain. In the year 2050, what will Mattala look like? Will it finally become the bustling hub Rajapaksa envisioned? Unlikely. The global aviation industry is consolidating around major hubs, not fragmenting into rural outposts. The most likely scenario is a slow, grinding decay. It will stand as a warning to future generations, a warning about the dangers of unchecked speculation, a warning about the hubris of believing we can conquer economic gravity with political will. The fishermen of Hambantota will still be there, casting their nets in the shadow of the Chinese-owned port. The farmers will still be drying their rice, perhaps once again on the floor of the cargo terminal. And the Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport will remain a pristine, silent tombstone for the Sri Lankan economy. It is beautiful in a tragic, dystopian way. It is a cathedral to the god of bad investments. It is the airport where no one arrives, but from which an entire nation cannot depart. This is built on money. We expose the cost of the world's most expensive mistakes. If you learned something from this autopsy of a nation's bankruptcy, subscribe to the channel. We have more stories of financial ruin coming soon.